Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Nick Winkelman, talking about his new book, The Language of Coaching, the Art and Science of Teaching Movement. So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Nick Winkelman. Nick is a highly successful coach, speaker, researcher, and now author. We had a really fun time discussing topics including, is there a place for the use of internal focus of attention cues, how to develop effective analogies, avoiding overcueing, and links between attentional focus cues and constraints. Hope you enjoy. Okay, today I'm joined by Nick Winkelman from Irish Rugby. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Nick.
Well, Rob, it's an honor. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this area?
Yeah. So, as an overarching, I've been a strength conditioning coach for the better part of 15 years now. And when I initially was in university, like most, exercise science degree, and I picked up a bit of personal training on the side. And I was going through this personal training certification course, and I met this guy named JC. And I remember I was watching him coach, and I was just trying to learn how he would program design, how he'd coach. I'd never done any kind of coaching before. And I remember when I was working with him, something stood out very early on that started to trigger my love of coaching language, and motor learning. And that is what he was doing differently with his clients with good success was not that he was programming any differently or, his reps and sets were any different, but rather this guy was communicating in a way that I had never heard any other coach communicate, any other personal trainer. In my experience, sure as heck hadn't reflected coaches that were that effective. And when I met him, I realized that, gosh, while I'm trying to learn to be a strength conditioning coach and I need to be studying periodization and exercise and program design, something about the way we communicate, something about being a teacher, something about the words we use is remarkably important. And so I banked that in the back of my mind when I was in college, and inevitably went on to work for a company called Exos, formerly Athletes Performance, which, Rob, you know all too well, where it got its roots in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And so working there, I did just about everything, but primarily focused on the NFL Combine development program, and I ran our coach education department, our mentorship department. I did that for 10 years before taking a job now with Irish Rugby, which I've been here for 4 years. And throughout that process, that initial spark that I got from Mr. JC in college around teaching and motor learning seemed to blossom and grow year on year. And notably, this idea of coaching language and teaching being so important really took off for me in 2009 when I took over the NFL Combine program at Exos. And in that first year running my program, I saw that while what we did was important, how we did it had equal measure. And really for me, it's been from that moment on that I've been studying this and trying to get better as a coach, but share my learnings with everyone else in the world.
Yeah, that's great. So, and I kind of alluded to, so what we wanted to talk about mostly today is your new book coming out, The Language of Coaching. You could tell by looking at the material and the things associated, obviously this is, I describe it as a passion project for you. So is this something you developing for a long, long time, this idea of putting this all in a book or?
Yeah. I think, again, I go back to that first moment and watching this guy coach. I went to another mentor at the time named Guido van Rijsegem. And I said, listen, this guy I'm watching out here, I don't know what he's doing, but I think it's something to do with his language and how he teaches. And I want to write a book one day called The Form Within. I don't know why I even said it. I don't know why it stuck out to me, but something in that very early moment, I was 19 or 20 at the time, I knew that this was something I wanted to do. And while the title of the book isn't The Form Within, The Language of Coaching, very much so, is the passion project that came from that moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And so the book covers a lot of, the language of coaching. A lot of it has to do, and what I wanted to focus on, because it's within my kind of interest is cueing. And
yes,
one of the interesting things, I always say, like in motor learning and research, you could probably count on one hand the really definitive findings from research. You got Fitt's law that almost works every time. And you count, yes. There's not many, but one of them is this internal versus external that's been demonstrated in so many studies that Gabby's done, almost to the point I get frustrated now when people external versus internal in skill. Why? Yes. Like, can we move on? It's but I wanted to ask, I think there's in the research, it seems to be really, really clear advantage for external is kind of what I'm saying. Very well replicated finding in many different ways. But where do you kind of stand on this issue right now with this internal versus external, in particular, applying it as a coach? Because I still think people are kind of uncertain about this in some ways.
Yeah. And I remember the first time, one of the first papers I read from Gabby, and I had that same feeling. I'm like, well, I can see how external is better than internal in this situation, but most certainly internal must be better over here. And like you, I've read all the papers, and it is a staggering finding. Yet, as I reflect as a coach, I know it is unavoidable that internal or body-based language has a role to play. And I've reflected a lot on that. And probably within the book is the first time I've really outlined where I believe internal language goes in the overall coaching narrative. And so I'll just briefly explain where I believe it lives. And that is this idea that when we coach, we have categorically many different forms of communication that we use along the way. I mean, we intro a session, then we intro an exercise, then we typically do a demonstration, then maybe we say a few more things. We watch them do the movement. Some coaches like to talk while that's happening, whether or not you agree with that. And then there's usually some kind of feedback. So as I was writing the book and reflecting on my own journey, I came up with this concept of the coaching communication loop. And I liked using the term the communication loop because I think that's exactly what we do. To the degree that we use communication, it loops around the athlete, it loops around the movement. And that is in no way to suggest that the athlete isn't part of the communication loop in that they're sharing their ideas and their own thoughts. They are, but very much so it's being driven from the coach. And so in the book, I talk about this as a 5-component model that it's not going to be new to anyone, but we describe a movement. We demonstrate a movement. So we have kind of that visual verbal. Then we provide the cue. And the cue is, if you would, the summary. So the description is, hey, Rob, today you're doing a squat. I need you to get under the bar, set up your feet. It's unavoidable when you're introducing a movement. You have to talk about the body. Or if you're doing some kind of video analysis, you want to talk about a specific body position, no worries. I call all that a description. The demonstration then is obviously used to the degree that the movement is new to someone. But the part that is always there is the cue, in that we are typically giving some kind of a summary thought. And I put it as it's the last idea that enters the athlete's head before they move. And it's in that cue that the language of coaching in the book is really about. How do we optimize that idea? And the way I like to phrase it to coaches is your words turn into their thoughts, which influence their movement. And so ultimately the cue, more so than the description, is going to have the greatest impact on the movement pattern itself. So describe, demonstrate, cue, you do, they have to perform it. And then there's some kind of debrief. And so collectively, I call that the long loop. But once you've taught someone and they're not a novice anymore, you don't need to go through that long description. You don't need to go through that demonstration unless they ask. So we go from the long loop then to what I like to call the short loop. The short loop is you cue, they do, and you debrief as a collective. And so when we look at that as a model, I talk about each of those components living in the same neighborhood. And so the external cues and analogies, they live in your cue house, okay? And then you have internal and external language. They live in the debrief and the description. And, Rob, I wanted to get your thoughts on this because in my view, it's not so much that we can't use internal language to describe something. We can. It has to be part of the conversation. but it's conditioning our athletes, our clients, and our patients to move under the guidance of external focus or visual analogies.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really critical. Yeah, I agree. And I like the way you lay out, like skill has like a temporal part structure to it, right? And sometimes we make these overarching statements like internal focus is bad. We don't mean all parts. Like you don't mean like a lot of people are saying, oh, the internal focus literature is flawed because you need to do internal focus when you're changing technique. No one meant it that way in practice when you're trying to break down a skill or when you're reflecting. Or I had the same with kind of people have talked about, when you talk about kind of self-organization and not being consciously aware. What we're talking about is that period, right, when you're executing, right? Not trying to do blanket over the whole thing. So I think you're right. We don't want an internal focus while you're actually executing the skill. Before and after, we can have that. To reflect or do some strategy or stuff. But you're right. That's why I like the last thing you say to them, because that's what you're trying to do, to put that in their head when they move. Yeah.
And I think within that, just to add to your points, this temporal patterning of the language, I observe a lot of coaches coach. As a part of my job with Irish Rugby, we video coaches, they self-assess, and then I provide some additional observational guidance. And what I find, not only with my own coaches, but many of the various coaches I've worked with over the years, is their cueing. If you actually were to take down everything that they say, they have a lot of really good external cues. They have a lot of really good analogies, but they might roll on like, okay, hey, we're doing the squat step on back. Now I want you to squat down as if you're sitting on a box, but to do that, flex your hips. And all of a sudden they'll have that external cue in the narrative, but they'll wrap it with so much linguistic noise that those good parts are not obvious. So I always try to explain to coaches, explain what you feel you need to explain to sleep well at night. Okay. But then take a deep breath, pause, and make sure it's clear to you and them that the last thing you are saying, or that they even came up with themselves, is what they're focusing on during the movement.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. And I have a question later on about over cueing. I get a lot of people asking me, but while we're on the topic though, one of the things, in this internal versus external research, one of the issues I see that I don't know how to quite address this in actual study, but, because there's this challenge in research where we always, control versus ecological validity in designing a study. And I think it was Dan Paff that I first talked to this about, that in the really good coach, when they use internal cues, are going to customize it, individualize it to the athlete they're working with. Yet in the research, we have to give everybody the same cues. So I don't know. Well, I wonder if we would get a little bit different story in the research. I don't think we would. Maybe they'd be closer, but if we did, had a coach work with every person in the study to individualize what they're saying. I don't know. That's one thing I think that's kind of disconnect between the practical and the research. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, I agree. I think there are examples of that being done. Gabby Wolf's early study on the soccer, chip shot, where they actually looked at the group who was getting, cues 100% versus 33%, and then they broke them into internal and external. They did have coaches in that who had a list of possible cues. And while it wasn't as precise as what Dan is talking about, they most certainly were using the best cue based on the error that they observed. And frankly, I do think more of that research needs to be done. To Dan's point, the first thing I would say is we know that preference, even though this hasn't been well researched, we know that early on, preference will mediate the effect of a cue. In that if I use an internal cue with someone that they're really used to versus give them some novel external cue, they're actually going to perform better with the internal cue in that moment. And same thing vice versa. But I think within that, we can't lose sight of the motivational factor and the familiarity and the psychological factors that go along with language. And thus, to your very point, I think the fact that we have controlled internal versus external across so many different contexts, movements, populations, it's hard to think that an internal cue in any situation would outperform an external if, and here's the following if I asked Dan to come into my study with sprinters, and I said, Dan, I want you to identify the precise cue for this individual. And I want you, once you've identified it, I want you to come up with an internal cue version that you're happy with and an external cue version that you're happy with. I strongly believe if he did that, and it is precise and individualized, the external would beat out the internal.
Yeah, I agree. That was kind of I think if you're right, to be a fair study, you have to customize, individualize both of them. And it might cause, it would probably make them both more effective, but still do that superiority. Yeah. So, so I mentioned like this finding, I don't, Gabby's kind of done two major reviews on this literature, right? I think like 15, 25 years. It's such a big, consistent finding. But still, you mentioned names we were talking about earlier, like Porter, people that have looked at what coaches actually do. And you mentioned it yourself that there's still this dominance of using internal cueing a lot of times. Do you think it's a lack of awareness? Is it just easier to do internal cueing? But why are people still latching on to the internal?
It's a great question, Rob. I think if I can just say the movement profession, and I'm trying to use the term movement profession more often because what we're talking about is inclusive of sport coaching, S&C, personal training, and the various therapeutic forms in the medical world. And so if you look at a lot of these academic programs and you look at a lot of these certifications, coaching, let alone coaching language, is oftentimes it's a footnote. It's a single module in a single course, if at all. And in fairness, if I look at a lot of the MSc programs in S&C and coaching, they are improving. We're seeing, as you said, this is a principle of motor learning. So luckily, we're seeing it come on board. So the first thing I would say is it's a failure of omission. We have forgot to tell people that describing a movement in biomechanical terms is not a one-to-one trade-off for how to teach it pedagogically from a coaching perspective. So I think people have latched on to the most obvious thing. Well, this is the language in my textbooks and in my certification for describing movement. It's exactly what I'm seeing in front of me. Let me simply use the same language in literal terms to coach a person. So you cannot fault anyone for coming to the logical conclusion to use internal language. And what I'm trying to do, and you and others, we're trying to change that narrative and fill that gap.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's the same with kind of a lot of things. It just seems intuitive. If I want someone to move like this, I should describe the movement. But it's not.
Your back. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mentioned, so I think we know, so there's this kind of internal, the other kind of, what kind of other kind of maybe bad practices or misunderstandings have you seen with respect to cueing when you're looking in the literature and with coaches?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, and I actually think this one's bigger than internal versus external, and that is over cueing. At the end of the day, the whole principle of internal, external, attentional focus, that's the new kid on the block from a research perspective. But in terms of attentional capacity, that's the old dog. That one's been around a long, long time. And so I like to make this qualifying statement. Number one, short-term memory and attention are not the same thing. I need my attention to scan, interrogate, and look in my short-term memory, but attention by itself is not the same as short-term memory. So I explain it like this. Think of short-term memory as a room, a dark room, okay? And there's only so many things you can put in that room. And as you and I both know, in the memory literature, there's still some questions on how many things that we can remember. But let's say it's 5 to 7 plus or minus 2 to 3, a phone number, give or take. Mm-hmm. And so it can only put so many things in this dark room. But I still need a way to see them. And so that's the spotlight I have. And so for me, that spotlight in the dark room is my attention. The room itself and what goes in it, working memory. The spotlight is attention. So why do I bring that up? Well, as I look in my working memory, trying to remember the 3 cues that coach just gave me, I can only put that spotlight on one cue at a time. So now I'm performing a movement in the case of swinging a baseball bat that happens in a fraction of a second. And you want me to flash that light over all three cues simultaneously in one instant? Not going to happen. So the biggest thing that I push forward, and it's the second chapter in the book, is that we have to get down to the one cue. We got to put the one idea, watch the echo of that idea in the movement. If you like what you see, stick with it. If you kind of like what you see, have a discussion and refresh it. If you don't like what you see, throw it out and start again. But just like a Lego, we got to build this learning when we use cues, one cue at a time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. As I said, I mentioned I've been talking a lot about this with a few coaches, and I think as a coach, pretty much everyone's had the experience of you have an athlete that shows up to you that's, I call it being all up inside your head, right? They're been over cued. They're thinking about every mechanical aspect of their movement, and so how do you go about getting them out of that?
I've dealt with the exact same thing, and I think number one, it's giving them a voice. With these individuals that are inside of their head, the overthinkers, ultimately that narrative is going all the time. And so in my belief, if I tell you not to think about a big white polar bear, what are you going to do? You're going to continue to think about a big white polar bear. You tell the overthinker to stop thinking, they're just going to think more. So in my opinion, we've got to give them a release valve. So in my experience, that release valve is conversation. So Rob, you're my athlete. Let's say I'm a hitting coach and you're an overthinker at the plate. And so I'm going to say, Rob, I want you to walk me through your process. What are you thinking? What are you dealing with? And I'm going to listen, and I'm just going to get you to talk and flow. And what I find is through that conversation, if they don't realize it themselves, you can ask the following question. Now, Rob, do you think you can focus on all of that at the same time when you're up at the plate? It's a very fair question, and you say it in an honest tone. Well, they're going to say intuitively, well, no, I can't. But if I think about this during this time and this during that time, then I can get there. I said, but okay, but you're saying we can't think about it all at the same time. Yeah. I said, okay. So for our next repetition, let's see if we can work together to take all that great insight you just shared. And right, I'm supporting it, I'm echoing it. And let's come up with one thing you can think about that you think be really helpful. And let's collaborate. And let's, we might not get it right. Let's try out some ideas until you find something. And so ultimately, through that process, the pressure valve is they've been heard, they've talked. The very physiology of our mind means I'm less likely to fixate on it. I've involved them, so now they feel they're part of the search for the solution. I use them to help me come up with the best cue for them. And we try some different cues on, like we're trying different pairs of shoes on. And in my belief, Rob, once we find that right cue and they see how well that process works, one, they can take it on themselves. But now I've worked them away from the detail, the massive micro, into the one idea that's going to help them. And if that idea does help them, that's that internal validation that this might be a better path. Now, there's probably other ways I could have answered that question, but I think as a general approach, that could work pretty well.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. I think the tendency of some coaches might be to say, you've been coached horribly, badly. Everything you've done is a waste of time. Try to forget it all, which is going to be really really demoralizing to the athlete.
Don't think about the big white polar bear, right? It's just not going to work. Yeah. It's not going to work.
The only other thing I've seen various people do is somehow demonstrate. There's certain sports is demonstrate if you don't do that, it helps. So I've seen people do things like where you have them hold a tennis racket the wrong way and say, I'm going to serve the ball at you, and you have to flip it and then hit it. Yeah. So you try to get the no time to think kind of approach. But I like that.
100%. Yeah. I like that approach to demonstrate it. Mm-hmm. But then you and I both know there's still this cognitive machinery going on. So I demonstrate it. That gives me buy-in. That says, okay, now they're open to something different. I still need to give them the cognitive strategy to overcome, because they're going to still want to default to type when they're under pressure, as you and I know all too well. So I think the reality is, I love that you shared that. Both of those in concert, probably somewhere in there lies the solution. Yeah. No, I think you're right. You definitely need to address the fact that that's in there. It's going to come back. Yes. Yeah. You can't just ignore it.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about, the very popular area that's, been growing is kind of this constraints-led approach to coaching. And I wanted to ask you about kind of connecting the attentional cueing with that kind of. I noticed in your some of the materials from your book, you've talked about constraints and attention. So I wanted to ask you kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I mean, first thing I will say, and I could be wrong here, but by the very nature, we as humans, I think, default to polarization wherever polarization is available. And most certainly, I believe the motor learning skill acquisition community, they're a very proud community. They've worked hard to digest some complex stuff, and they're very happy then to simplify it and share. And they're motivated behind their solutions that, in fairness, they've seen work. And so oftentimes, just to make the first point, people are putting constraints up against cues, or instructional approaches, which is language, versus non-instructional approaches, which is constraints. And the first thing I will say is they both have a role. And I can say that simply in that there's always an environment. There's always an environment guiding movement, and there is always a thinker. There is always a human thinking. So to say one is better than the other, for me, is almost like that example where you gave it of the person flips around the racket and then hits the ball to show how not thinking helps. But yet then there's still someone thinking on the next repetition when they go back to doing it normal. So for me, it's how do we get these two things to harmonize? Okay. So first point now, constraints. What are constraints trying to do? Constraints are trying to manipulate a feature of the environment to increase the odds that the athlete, client, or patient tries a different movement strategy. We decrease the odds of certain movement strategies, increasing the likelihood that the person will find a different solution. So for example, we like to talk about Franz Bosch a lot. One of the reasons the no hand running works is because it increases the amount of instability in the upper body, making the upper body have to become more stable, which has a positive influence on lower body mechanics. That only becomes self-evident once I get rid of the arms. And once I've done that, then I can reintroduce the arms. At the same time, I could equally, rather than just taking away the arms to make that physical change, I could come up with a cue. I could come up with a cue such as stand tall. I come up with a cue such as imagine you have a belt buckle, lead with that belt buckle. Come up with a cue as imagine Mike Tyson's about to punch you in the stomach. I want you to stay nice and strong throughout the run. Ultimately, the constraint is in the physical environment. It can be observed. And what is the constraint doing? It's shifting focus. It's shifting my focus from one area to another by adding or taking something away. When we look at cueing, cueing is doing the exact same thing. It's saying rather than focusing on A, let's focus on B. And more often than not, especially if we're using analogies, we're utilizing imagined constraints. Move as if a wall was here. Move as if there was a cliff to your right side. Move as if you were a jet taking off. Insofar as the processing of that language, it's trying to achieve something, I would say, identical to a physical constraint. We're limiting the possibility of certain movement solutions by having them focus on either a change, literal or not, in the environment, or focusing on somewhere different in the environment. So ultimately, both have a place. It's whether I try to manipulate your focus through an indirect approach using the external constraint, or a direct approach. I ask you to focus on something different.
Yeah, no, I really agree. I think one of the reasons that the constraints-led approaches works for a lot of people is you essentially get external focus for free, right? I did my baseball study I just published a couple of years ago. I was trying to get people to hit the ball in the air more. So I put a barrier across the field. Yeah. The first thing you say to them is hit the ball over the barrier. That's an external focus that in most cases, it's almost impossible not to use an external cue when you use a constraint. They go together so I really think it's probably an additive effect. We're seeing a lot of cases.
100%. And by the very nature, it is an external cue. Mm-hmm. You are bringing their attention into the environment. The constraint is the environment. They're a perfect pair.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. And yeah, so I think there's some good points there. Another thing I really like that you did in the book from the materials I saw is analogies. We've talked about it a few times already, and everyone knows, there's a good growing literature on that. And when you hear people talk about it, everybody uses the same ones, the cookie jar, basketball, free throw. And I think part of the reason they do that is, when talking to coaches, I've seen this, is developing good analogies is not that easy, right? For some of them, it's automatic, but I think you do a great job in the book of showing how to break it down. So it's not just about finding, hey, there happens to be something that captures everything, like in my sport. You can actually build one, right, by understanding the sport skill.
100% you can.
Yeah.
And, so chapter 6, which is called Going Analog, I try to nod to my love of music and DJ wherever I can. Mm-hmm. So Going Analog is just about that. It's about how to create analogies. And the reality is, though, to talk about analogy is to talk about thinking in general. I mean, even as people are listening to this podcast, they are taking, Rob, what you are saying and what I am saying, and they're putting it into their own words. They are using our examples. We talked about baseball, but maybe we have a golfer listening in, and I'm sure they've analogized it to golf. And so we do this all the time. I mean, even some of the data points around normal human speech, talk about 5 to 6 analogies being used a minute in normal conversation. We constantly call things by something else to make a connection. I mean, think about the way you talk to children or your children versus an adult versus a new athlete versus one that you've never worked with before versus a foreign athlete where English is their second language. In all of these cases, you change how you communicate. And I would argue that the single biggest thing that you change is how you use language and draw associations. And what are associations? One thing compared to another. That's what an analogy is. So the first step in creating an analogy is identifying the person in front of you, what's familiar to them. And by that meaning, what kind of language do they use to describe this world that they live in? So it's their internal narrative is what I typically say. And so the only way that we're going to hear that is listening to them, asking them questions, and being able to make broad assumptions around, let's say, are they a child? What currently is in popular song or popular media? And from that perspective, can I use examples of superheroes rather than giving them some strict internal cue? And so from that perspective, understand what's familiar to them. Number 2, then you need to know what's wrong with the movement you're trying to coach. And you have to be able to hide the biomechanics in the analogy. The best way to illustrate this is think of a sprint. Would you ever tell someone to sprint off the line like a helicopter taking off? No. But you might say sprint off the line like a jet taking off. What's the difference? Well, both are kind of these fast things that go in the air, but the reality is a helicopter goes straight up, but a jet goes straight forward. The jet's more like sprinting. So I need to know what's familiar to them. Otherwise, the association will be dead in the water. The second thing is to know the biomechanics I'm trying to encourage and hide them in a comparison they will be familiar with. And I can't get into it now because we don't have time, but in there, then I go through that in greater detail and give 3 different categories of analogies that people can create. And I find once people learn about this, they find the process of analogy creation just comes to them very easily.
Yeah, no, I thought you used some great examples in there. And I think when you're talking there, it reminded me, there's a couple of things. One, it made me think of, an area that I think is under research and we don't think about all the time is the understanding and interpretation of cues by the individual. How do you kind of think about that in the book? You already mentioned it with the analogies, right?
Yeah. Well, that's it though. The analogy section is really a section on relationship building. I mean, Rob, even right now, what I love is if people even got to this point, paused it and went back to the beginning and listened to our conversation again. As I'm saying things, Rob, you're repeating them back to me in your own words. Okay. That is fantastic. That doesn't take that as my explanation is better or yours. That's up to the listener. The reality is we're coming from our internal narrative. We're using words that make sense to us, that shorten the barrier to understanding. And so all we have to do to be providing effective external cues, analogies, and an effective communicator in general is active listening. If I am actively listening to you, and let me give a perfect example. or hopefully a perfect example. See, a perfect example for me, possibly.
Yeah.
And so I'm working with you, Rob, on your sprinting. And I watch a couple repetitions. I say, okay, Rob, on your next repetition, I want you to push the line away. And I even point, see that start line there? I literally want you to push that line away. That line is trying to take your money, your life, everything. It is your enemy. Push that line away. And then I say to you, okay, Rob, what do I want you to do on the next repetition? And you say to me, you want me to drive the line away. So I used the active verb push. I emphasized it. I said it even 3 times. But your processing of the word push got exchanged for drive. Something about the verb drive connects with you more. Now, if I am an active coach, actively listening, I say, exactly, Rob, I want you to drive that line away on your next repetition. And so once I learned to do that, game changer. And it sounds so simple, and it is, but you have to be aware that that opportunity as a coach exists to exploit it. And so any and every opportunity I had to hear how my athletes would come up with their own cues, hear the way they interpret my cues, or even pay attention when they rephrase them on their own, unprompted. This gives you access to their language locker. And once you have access to their language locker, you are far closer to their understanding. Because it's not about your understanding. You speak from a place of understanding. Otherwise, you wouldn't say those words. It's about getting to their understanding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And the other thing it made me think of is, kind of an everyday example of this for me is, when you have read a book and then seen a movie, almost 90% of the time people like the book better because you filmed the book in your head using your own experience, right? And you take it in your own context. And then you see the directors and like, that's pretty good, but that's not, so we do so you can't remove this subjectivity from all of this, right? Our own way we interpret things based on, our attention, what we're focusing on and our experience in past. Yeah, definitely.
But Rob, this is why Gabby Wolf is moving into the social determinants and their association with learning. And she is spot on. I mean, I'll give you an example. The other day, I'm working with my son on how to ride his bike. And people say, well, what cues are you giving? I'm telling him, well, I don't need to tell him not to fall off. He does that one time and he knows that's not a good thing to do. And I give him 2 things. I say, listen, wherever you look is where the bike is going to go. So again, if you want to go down the road, I need you focusing down the road. Otherwise, if you look at the curb over there, you're going into the curb. I said, so that's number 1. Number 2 is you got to get enough speed to get rhythm. So we talk about pedals and pushing. So it's pushing and sight. That's it. The rest is up to him to sort out. But he kept wanting to go back to using his training wheels. Now, Rob, you and I both know you've taught your kids, I'm sure, how to ride a bike or given them the opportunity to teach themselves. Probably a better way to put it. Mm-hmm. Kids can ride with training wheels. And it looks pretty close to riding a bike. We're talking about constraints here, right? Mm-hmm. But the second those training wheels come off, that kid ain't riding that bike. No. So if I had a third child, I would never even show them training wheels at all, if I'm honest. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I had to get my son motivated to want to try this more challenging thing. Because in his mind, what's he saying is like, listen, I'm on the walk right now. I'm riding my bike down the sidewalk. When I take these things off, I'm falling on my face. Why would I do that? Mm-hmm. And so for him, it was a matter of trying to come up with an analogy, a relatable analogy to get him motivated, self-motivated to try this thing without the training wheels. And I said, Madden, do you still wear a diaper? And he looks at me, he's 4. He's like, no, I don't pee in my pants. And I said, okay, exactly. You don't pee in your pants. But if you kept wearing a diaper, what would you continue to do? And he said, I'd keep peeing in my pants. I said, exactly. So if we keep putting these training wheels back on, are you ever going to want to try to ride the real thing? And I kid you not, Rob, you got this on video. He looked up at me and he kind of huffed and he looked down. He picked up the training wheels and he walked over to the bin, the garbage can, and he chucked them in there. He walked back over to the bike. He pointed at it and said, I'm going to ride you. And by that afternoon, he was riding over about 20 meters before he looked and went into the curb. And so the moral of the story is this. the more I coach, the more I realize that we have to bring them on the journey. We have to involve them in the learning process. They have to want to own it, because at the end of the day, we're facilitators, we're guides. They're the ones doing it. So back to Gabby's work on motivation and autonomy, I think it is paramount, and it's the right section for motor learning to be moving in.
Yeah, no, I agree. I love the way that she's added it on top of, she hasn't completely gone off into a totally different area. She's kind of adding it all together, which I think we kind of don't do very often. So on that topic, I know we've already talked about a few of these, but I know you, in the book, you do a great job of of summarizing a really large body of research in this area. Did you have any kind of thoughts on what are some of the main questions and issues that you'd like to see the research go to next in this area?
Well, a couple different things. One, I'd like to see a lot more on analogy. And you've already said that a couple different times. I think the best coaches I think of were storytellers. They put little pictures in your mind that made everything come together and so much easier. So I think analogies, most certainly. Within the actual attentional focus literature, I'd love to see some combination work being done. And I think some of it is starting to happen, where maybe you go from this internal explanation where you say, hey, here's what's happening. Here's what I want you to do. And then you cap that with an external cue or an analogy, and then even vice versa. And there's some early work on that, but I think that's getting into, we talk about kind of validity of environment and making things authentic. I think that's far more authentic to how coaches are going to coach. So I think that's quite interesting. I'd love to see some more work, back to Dan Paff's point, on preference. And that is, let me actually give, and Gabby Wolf did some of this very early on, so let's build on it. Give them some choice. So say, okay, you're about to perform this movement. Here are 3 different external cues and or 3 different internal cues. Pick the one that you'd like to use the most. And there's some studies that have done this, but I think more of that work to look at the intersection of preference and possibly specificity. It's a nod to the motivational piece as well on the autonomy. And I think the final 2, Brad Schoenfeld has done a bit more on the mind-muscle connection and looking at possibly internal cueing being more beneficial for hypertrophy. I definitely don't think we have that with great certainty, but I think looking at some isolated muscle-based work and internal cues for hypertrophic response could be interesting. But probably the big one, Rob, and I don't know exactly how you study this, but I know it's critical, and it's the number one question I get, is awareness. People oftentimes confuse being aware of your body as being the same thing as an internal cue. Now, I'd love your opinion on this. We probably could do a podcast on this one by itself, but let me just explain what I mean. When I use the word awareness, to be aware of something, it must have already occurred. I cannot be aware of something that has not yet to have happened. Okay. So even active awareness is in a delay. So if I say, I want you to be aware of how your hip feels, my hip needs to have done something before I'm aware of how that thing felt. For me, that is very different than an internal cue. An internal cue says, Rob, I want you to focus on squeezing your glute, or I want you to focus on actively extending your hip. That means I am sending the signal down to control what that hip is doing. That is very different than the hip doing whatever it wants to do within the task and me asking you to be aware of it in hindsight. And so for me, I talk about this in the book. I think awareness is critical. Intuitively, I know it's valuable. The way I use it is as follows. After a repetition has occurred, I will ask questions. Did that feel light or heavy? Did you feel tall or short? Did you feel loose or stiff? And while I don't necessarily ask them, sometimes I do, about any given joint, I start working to build a vocabulary around awareness that is holistic vocabulary. And by holistic, it represents how the whole body, the whole movement felt. So I think teasing out awareness as a way to guide and shape movement versus an internal cue, I think they're different. I'd like to see more work on the value of awareness and its subsequent impact on reps once I've been aware of the ones prior to them.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. And we've done a little bit of this in kind of the attention choking stuff I've done is kind of separating controlling and monitoring, controlling a movement with your attention and kind of monitoring what's going on, which is sort of the awareness category. What we find inevitably monitoring leads to control, so I think monitoring is kind of an ineffective awareness, maybe, but the word you use, holistic, I really like. So I think effectively having awareness is being aware of the more higher level properties of your movement. Maybe, right. Did that feel smooth? Did that feel, instead of, so we don't want you to be aware, oh, my elbow was bent at the right angle. That we be aware of the kind of more qualities of the movement, I think is where we want. But I agree. It's a tough, tricky thing to study, but I think it's really important too. Yeah.
It is. And, Rob, it's a footnote here, but I think it's an important one. You and I both know many coaches have gone decades using internal cues and they've had success. And I don't know if I've ever said this on a podcast, so hopefully I can put it in some form of an intelligible way. And that is this. First of all, if we look at the research, it's not that people can't get better utilizing internal cues. Typically, the trajectory of improvement is upward. It's just not the same trajectory or magnitude as external cues. And so that's the first thing is internal cues, my colleague used this term, I like it, are kind of like a weak signal. They still give us a signal. They still give us an insight into what to do. But the strength of that signal, the strength of that guidance, if you would, is not nearly as strong as the correct or the equivalent external cue. So let me start with that as a point. The second point is this. If you do anything long enough, you get better. It's not like an internal cue stops progress. So if I go out and I do 10 sprints 3 times a week, in a couple of weeks, I'm probably going to be faster or fitter or whatever the physical goal was. It doesn't necessarily mean my coordination is massively improved, but I will get better. So I think with that, internal cues provide a little bit of a red herring in that it's not that the cue works. It's that the work that they did works and they're better despite the internal cue, not because of it. And thus recognizing that says you are making progress, you have made improvement, but available to you is something completely free. It is a profound principle-based finding in the scientific literature. And by the way, it will build a better relationship with your athlete because learning will become easier. And by the very nature of how I'm suggesting you do it, you'll connect with them better.
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. And, it's why we need proper control groups in research, right? Yeah. We're human beings are learning, adapting machines. It's really hard to stop us, no matter how
from getting better.
We're going to get better almost no matter what you do. And so I think that's a great point. And I think, what we're trying to do is make you learn more effectively. And part of that is playing the long game, playing transfer. I think this approach to doing like you do is, I don't know if there's any research showing it, but I would imagine it's going to make athletes better if they have to make kind of a technique change in the long run, or they have to recover from injury. If they're used to doing this process themselves and in external cues, I think it would make you better at doing that than always if there's this one cue you've always used and it doesn't work anymore, you're used to kind of being flexible. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. You're right. We're going to get better no matter almost what you do, but we're trying to even add on top of that, the learning rate. Yeah.
And the thing about this, and this is speaking to all the coaches and everyone listening in, this, what we're asking you to consider here is difficult. I've oftentimes called my courses the invisible edge because I do believe this is the invisible edge. It's like electricity. You can't see it, but whether or not it's working. Mm-hmm. And cueing for me is very similar. I can't physically see the words, but I can see whether or not it works inside that athlete's body once I'm paying attention to the right things. But ultimately, as coaches, we constantly are trying to change our athletes, our clients, and our patients' behaviors, their physical behaviors and their lived behaviors. This thing we're talking about here, coaching language, this is your behavior. And thus, in the same level of difficulty, it takes for someone to change nutrition habits, to change their movement. We all say, oh, once someone's in their 20s, it's really difficult to change their movement. Well, guess what? Same thing goes for coaching language. It's something we do all the time, pay little attention to, but can pay massive dividends if we start. And that's why in the book, you would have seen this chapter 7. I call it the roadmap. It's an entire chapter that maps out how you will change your behavior as a coach. Because if we don't provide that, then this is just going to be empty words that cause frustration. Because we're like, listen, I know Rob and Nick say external cues and analogies are better, but like you said earlier, I don't know how to create them. I don't know how to change this habit. Well, that's why I've gone to the lengths I have with the book to make the book a developmental experience by inviting the readers to participate in their own examples, but putting an entire chapter that has a roadmap on how to do this. And so once we realize that coaching is a behavior, we're going to take it a lot more serious because it takes that focus to make the change in ourselves.
Yeah, no, I like that. I find the same thing, especially working with people that are mostly outside of psychology. I think there's kind of a reluctance and a disbelief to accept how powerful language is, right? I've done all this learning about nutrition, physiology, and you tell me it can be undone because I say drive instead of push. Right? No one wants to believe that, but it's true. Yeah.
Well, Rob, as you know, Gabby's first study was rejected on that merit alone, in that the reviewers could not believe that something so trivial as pushing through a wheel versus foot could matter, that they made her do a second study. I mean, even she didn't believe that the magnitude was going to be as high as it was. And at the end of the day, people need to look no further than their own experience. Go out and go for a walk and think about bending your knees while you're walking versus just walking, right? Or riding a bike and thinking about flexing your hip. This is so intuitive. Allow that intuition then to come into your coaching, and you'll quickly realize how many things you say you would not want them thinking about in a competition. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. So I guess we should wrap it up. We could talk for 3 hours probably, but just to wrap it up. So maybe tell us a little bit about what people are interested in the book. I know it's coming out later this month, right? But I know you've done a bunch of other things to go along with it. If you're interested right now, that you can go see. Yeah. Can you tell a little bit about that?
So the book is available for pre-order on Amazon, all the normal channels. Again, the full title is The Language of Coaching, the Art and Science of Teaching Movement. My website, though, thelanguageofcoaching.com, if you go on it right now and just simply put your email in the subscriber, there's 2 different times it prompts you to do that, you'll instantly get an email. And what I've created is a brand new 2-hour mini course on the language of coaching, which pulls the ideas that we've been talking about in a coherent narrative. And then also the slides are automatically there for download. So currently only subscribers can get that. But by the end of the month, I'm going to make it open to everybody. I'm not looking to hide this stuff. At the end of the day, Rob, just like you, I want people to become better coaches so that the mass amount of people that love to move and learn to move can get better at it.
Yeah. No, I've always admired that about you and a lot of other people. You know, how much you make of it. You're always making your slides and your materials available instead of hoarding it as little secrets. Yeah.
Absolutely. The book ultimately, obviously, it does cost something. You know, it's over 15 years of my life into it. So, you know, I hope people will get a copy and give a copy to coaches that they value. Ultimately, that's value, but I want to make sure the information is accessible.
Yeah, no, I think it will be a really asset for a lot of people. So thanks for taking the time to talk with me, Nick.
Rob, thank you so much. And for everything you do, man, you're an all-star.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Nick. You can find out everything about Nick's book, pre-order it, which I would highly recommend, and get access to a bunch of great free materials by going to thelanguageofcoaching.com. And remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.